Hi, everyone. Welcome to Friday Fellowship and to the end of the week. We've made it. This week, our hearts are with all of those in Texas and Oregon and other areas where you've lost power and the temperatures are freezing. We are praying for you. Please reach out if there are any ways this community can support you. As we begin our meeting, let's take some time to be silent and come to God on our own and make ourselves present to God.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Claremont Christian Fellowship. Thank you, Lorraine, for starting off our Friday night. For those of you who have not met Lorraine, I highly encourage you to reach out to her and chat with her soon because you will not regret meeting the lovely Lorraine. And speaking of meeting people, I shall introduce myself. So my name is Oluyemisi Balandero. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a second year at Pomona majoring in Africana Studies. And in light of Valentine's Day +5, I am going to list 5 things that I love about CCF throughout the night. And the first thing would be CCF itself, because I think having this community is wonderful. Even though it's in a virtual setting, I still love it. And the next 3 things are actually part of my announcements for tonight. So my second favorite thing about CCF is the post-Friday Fellowship Hangout. So I get to spend quality time with all of you right after tonight's fellowship. We'll be gathering on Zoom as usual, and although we cannot enjoy each other's presence in person, we can create all the good feels on Zoom. And you're more than welcome to chill with us because, Friday Fellowship Hangout. The Zoom link is in the emails that Lorraine sends out throughout the week and also in the Facebook Messenger group. The third favorite thing that I love about CCF are the workouts with Matt. So CCF offers ways to strengthen your mind, body, or mind, soul, and body, wrong order. So join Pomona alum Matt for weekly Saturday workouts at 10 a.m. PST over Zoom. I'm going to be completely honest. I have been stalling the entire school year to come to one of these workouts. So my first moment in Matt's morning muscle molding was this past Saturday. And, all this time I've been saying next time, and last week was finally my time. And I've also been in workout groups where you're kind of shamed for not being able to do everything. I'm not going to lie, Matt did probably over 100 push-ups, and I could barely do 10 proper ones. But the nice thing is that he offers ways to modify the workout throughout the time you're there. So you never feel like, it's a bad environment. So I hope to see some of you at the workouts moving forward. And my fourth favorite thing is the ways that we connect scripture to everyday life. So next week, we will begin our new series, Reconstructing Christian Ethics. And our first topic will have a presentation and discussion. And that special topic is, how should Christians think about sex? So be sure to tune in the following weeks to learn more and join us as we learn. And my fifth and final thing will be shared after the message about the 4 Gospels by Chris. So I listed 4 favorite things, and now we're going to learn about the 4 Gospels with Chris. And Chris, I will now hand it off to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Oluyemisi. It's so good to see you and hear from you. And to all of you out there who are watching right now or who will watch this recorded, I'm really glad to be here with all of you. I've put a lot of work into tonight's message. I hope you find it as helpful as I did writing it. I really enjoyed it. I got to bring together some things that I've been learning about for a long time, but haven't had many chances to talk about. So tonight, looking at this question, why are there 4 Gospels and why are they different? Now let's imagine for a moment we have someone who is unfamiliar with the Bible. They've never read it. They don't know much about it, but they're curious to learn more about Jesus. And so they decide to read it for themselves. So they open up the New Testament and they read the first book there. the Gospel according to Matthew. And sure enough, it's exactly what they expected to find. You've got the story of Jesus, his birth, his ministry, where he gathers these 12 disciples and does miracles and preaches and heals people. And eventually he has lots of arguments with the religious leaders. He gets arrested, he is crucified, and then he rises again. And it's the full story. And this, our reader, our hypothetical reader says, great, that was excellent. That's what I thought I'd find. I wonder what else is in this New Testament. And they turn the page and find the Gospel according to Mark, which is the same thing over again, the story of Jesus. And they read through the story of Jesus, and they get to the next book, and they find the Gospel according to Luke, yet another story about Jesus and his life. And now they're thinking, what is this all there is in the Bible? They peek ahead to the fourth book, and the fourth book is the Gospel according to John, another story about the life of Jesus. At this point, they might be wondering, why have 4 different books telling the same story? But they're a very attentive reader, and as they read through them, they begin to notice that there are strange differences between the 4 books. Some of them are just stylistic, maybe, and other things, but others are just surprising, right? So they notice that only Matthew and Luke contain stories about Jesus' birth. And Mark and John don't mention anything about Jesus until Jesus is an adult, beginning his ministry. When they read those birth accounts in Matthew and Luke, they notice that they're completely different, that they have completely different elements to those stories and don't share them with each other. So other than the idea of Mary giving birth to Jesus by the power of the Holy Spirit. So that's consistent, but these other stories aren't there. So Luke doesn't mention the story that Matthew shares about Herod killing all the children in and around Bethlehem under 2 years old, trying to kill this future king that he's heard about. That's a big deal to leave out of your story, Luke, especially if, as Luke says, Luke has carefully researched all of these things. Nor does Luke mention Jesus and his family having to flee to Egypt to avoid the killing and living there for a period of time. On Matt's side, Matt doesn't mention so many of the things that are familiar to us in the Christmas story. The travel to Bethlehem, not finding a place to stay, staying with animals, Jesus being born in a manger, shepherds coming to visit, all of that stuff. Why are they so different? And this is nothing until the reader gets to John, when things really begin to look unusual. Our fictional reader notices that even the way Jesus talks in the Gospel of John is different. And almost none of his stories and teachings from the first 3 Gospels show up in John, apart from the big thing like the resurrection, the death and resurrection at the end, and a few little details. Our very observant reader wonders, why, in the supposedly authoritative book about Jesus, would you have 4 sometimes weirdly different accounts about his life? Wouldn't it make more sense to have just one definitive story? I think it's funny that for those of us who grew up in the church, we take it for granted that there are 4 Gospels. And no one ever points out the ways that they're different or maybe don't fit together so perfectly. When I was in seminary, my New Testament professor, going over the 4 Gospels with us, we had a whole class, a whole quarter on the 4 Gospels. He shared about when he was a college student. He had grown up in a very conservative church background that had a very, very particular view of the literal accuracy of the Bible, and everything had its place. And he told us the story about coming to this point of realizing the differences in the Gospels and some of the reasons behind them, which we'll get into, and becoming so angry and disillusioned and upset that he threw his Bible across the room in his dorm room. Now, obviously, he got over it. He became a New Testament teacher at a Christian seminary. But it was a big, challenging thing for him at the time, something he never had to deal with until college. I want to say that dealing honestly with this question about these 4 different Gospels is actually tremendously helpful to our faith and to our understanding about this book, which is our holy text. And so I want to share with you some of those things that I've learned and I've found helpful. The first thing we need to know is that the Gospels were written decades after Jesus' time on earth. So if we place the crucifixion at being around 33 CE, that up until the time the Gospels were written, Christians relied on the spoken testimony of the people who'd been with Jesus. This spoken testimony became an oral tradition that was shared with new converts as the faith spread around the Mediterranean. And this testimony and tradition was reinforced by occasional visits from the original disciples and letters that they would write to these different congregations. And that's the whole way people are learning about Jesus until the very first Gospels are written around the mid-60s CE and later. So, some 30, 35 years of just that oral testimony and tradition. It's only when that first generation of witnesses starts dying off that people feel the need for written testimonies. We have to get this written down so it can be remembered and passed on. We don't know who wrote any of the Gospels. The titles for them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were added later by the church based on church tradition and memory about who wrote what. Scholars have reasons for questioning some of these attributions, so there's different levels of certainty around them. But none of the Gospels themselves name in the text the author of them. Now, just for convenience, I'm going to sometimes refer to the authors by these names. I'm not looking to get into the question of who wrote what and all of that tonight. But these Gospels were written in and for particular communities. They told the story of Jesus in ways that spoke to their theological concerns and questions and addressed the kinds of challenges they were facing in these different communities. Then the Gospels that were written were copied and passed on to other churches and collected until we have the four together that we have now. And that actually happened pretty quickly in the first century or so, second century of the church. Now, here's the thing. At any point in time, they could have dumped 1, 2, or 3 of those Gospels if they felt like they weren't true enough or they didn't like how they told the story differently. Or they could have condensed them down into one story, like our hypothetical first-time Gospel reader wanted. This actually happened in the mid-2nd century. This Christian apologist named Tatian harmonized all 4 Gospels into one book called the Diatessaron. And that was used by Tatian's community. But the thing is, the rest of the church never adopted the Diatessaron. They could have taken that and said, this is great, let's use this. It's much clearer to have this one story. But they didn't. They chose to stick with the 4 Gospels. This should tell us something about our Bible. As uncomfortable as it might be to find the story told differently four times over, the church has always valued having these distinct accounts about the life of Jesus. We have 4 Gospels for a reason. And we are missing out if we don't pay attention to what each one of them wants to say, if we fall into that trap of trying to smooth them over and make them all sound exactly the same. So let's give some of that individual attention to each of the authors, and I'm going to take us through sort of a survey of the 4 Gospels now. The first Gospel written was the Gospel of Mark, probably in the mid to late 60s, and it was most likely written in Rome. Now, this was a time of great stress and violence for Christians on both ends of the Mediterranean Sea. In Palestine, there was massive violence happening. In 66, a Jewish revolt began against the Roman Empire. It was brutal. When the revolt started, it began with an ambush of the Roman legion in Syria, and they slaughtered 6,000 Roman soldiers getting this thing going. And Rome freaked out. They did not like rebellions. They wanted to keep all of their territories under control. So Rome sent 4 legions in to crush the rebellion. And these legions came in, they made war at multiple strongholds throughout Palestine, laid siege to these cities. People were starving to death. There was great slaughter. Lots of people died. And it all culminated in the year 70 when the Roman legions came and laid siege to Jerusalem. The siege lasted 7 months, after which they broke through the walls, killed people throughout the city, and utterly destroyed the temple. So this is just a really intense, shocking thing in Palestine, and to see the temple destroyed and Jerusalem sacked. Now, also in the mid-60s, on the other side of the Mediterranean, Emperor Nero launched the first imperial persecution of Christians. There was a major fire that had happened in Rome, and it destroyed much of the city. And the rumors around the city were that Nero had started the fire himself because he wanted to illegally clear some land to build a new palace, land that did not belong to him, to build a new palace there. Now, whether or not he started the fire, he did actually build the palace on the burned area, and people in Rome were furious and putting the blame on Nero. So Nero did what a slippery politician does, and he deflected the blame to the Christians. He blamed this weird community of Christians now living in Rome for starting the fire. And he had them arrested. Any Christians he could find were arrested. Some of them were torn apart by dogs. Others of them he had burned alive. Both Peter and Paul may have died in this persecution. They were both in Rome around this time and didn't survive past it. So, in the midst of this area, with Roman troops devastating Palestine and terrible persecutions in Rome, someone, maybe it was Peter's companion, John Mark, as church tradition says, someone wrote a gospel. If you were writing a message of hope for Christians living through violent times of war and arrest and torture, all these horrible things, if you were writing to Christians in that time, what kind of gospel would you write? What would you want them to know about Jesus? Well, we see what Mark wants them to know in the first line of Mark's gospel, which begins, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." That sounds pretty straightforward. It sounds like what you expect a book about Jesus to say. It's the gospel, the good news about Jesus Christ. He's God's Son. Makes sense. Except these words had very specific meaning at that time in that place. For example, no one had written a gospel before. There was no such literary genre as gospel. Gospel is an Old English translation of the Greek word euangelion, which I've included in the text there. And euangelion means good news. But it's not the normal word for good news. There's another more common phrase for good news in ancient Greek. This word had a very particular meaning in Rome. It was the word that was used to proclaim the good news of military victory, and also the birth of emperors, the protectors and leaders of the nation. It was a word of Roman propaganda. It was a declaration of political supremacy. Good news, we've crushed the enemies of Rome. Mark is intentionally taking a Roman idea and repurposing it to start his gospel. And not just that part, but the last part too, the phrase, Son of God. This was a phrase that was used to describe Roman emperors. They saw themselves as gods or sons of gods. And we have the great combination of these two ideas in an inscription dated to 9 BC about the birth of Caesar Augustus. And it's long. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm just going to put up here and I'm going to bold the key phrase on it. It goes on and on about providence and selecting Augustus and how Augustus is going to save. Notice it uses the word savior about 4 lines down. It calls Augustus a savior, both for us and our descendants. And then it ends with this sentence, "Since the birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of good tidings, euangelion, for the world that came by reason of him." You catch that? The birth of Caesar Augustus was the beginning of the good news, and he's called a god. And now we look back at what Mark had to say, the beginning of the good news, euangelion, of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Mark is doing something very intentional here. Mark is tying his gospel to the Roman imperial messages about the Caesars. And it is a very subversive thing that he is doing, because he is advocating not for a Caesar, but for a Jewish king, a carpenter, who was God in the flesh, not a Roman emperor. And while Rome is throwing its violent power around in Palestine and in the city of Rome, the real king, the real power is Jesus, and this is his story. Mark's anti-imperial message continues throughout the gospel. Jesus begins his ministry by saying, this is the first thing he preaches in his ministry, "The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news. Jesus' message begins with the proclamation of another kingdom, which again, at this time period, it would have stood out to everyone in bright letters. This is a seditious statement. There is another kingdom besides the kingdom of Rome. And that kingdom message is Jesus' core message throughout the Gospel of Mark. He comes back to it time and again. Mark focuses on all of Jesus' demonstrations of his authority. So much of what we see about Jesus in Mark is Jesus demonstrating through his healing and his miracles and his casting out demons that he has divine authority in this world. At one point, he comes across a man living among tombs who is possessed by many evil spirits, the gospel says. So many that when Jesus asks the man his name, the man says, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Again, legion is a term that was only used for large Roman military units. Now, this is a story, of course, about Jesus casting evil spirits out of someone and Jesus showing his power over evil. But no reader at this time could have read this and not have lights flashing in their eyes like, oh my gosh, he's talking about Rome. He's saying something about Rome here. What does Jesus do? He casts out this army of spirits into a nearby herd of swine who then run down the hills into the nearby lake and drown themselves in the water. It's a story of Jesus' power over evil, but it's also kind of a nasty shot at Rome. I could go on with the anti-imperial message in Mark, talk about Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem as a king, how when the Romans crucified Jesus at the end, they crucify him for the act of being seditious against Rome. That's the charge brought against him. And they hang the sign, King of the Jews, over his head as a taunt. But of course, Mark means us to see this as this is Jesus' moment of glory. And he is the real King of the Jews. It's a moment of irony. And in the biggest irony of all, the person present who recognizes who Jesus is, his true kingship, is a Roman soldier. It's a Roman soldier who declares, truly, this man was God's son. The author of Mark is waving his arms at us in just vehement message, this saying, forget this all-powerful empire. Here is the king. Here is the king. This is a timely message for all of us. Think of all the ways we suffer under empire or other people suffer under empire in this world. And to know that that God is greater than empire, that Jesus has undermined and has proven false the empires of the world, and how important a challenge it is for all the ways that we are empire, especially in America and the powerful nations of the world, that we act as empire, remembering who the true king is and what happens to empires when they come against the true king. Now, of course, there's so much more in Mark than just this theme. I'm highlighting it because it's so unique and powerful in Mark. It comes through so strongly. But we also see in Mark love for those on the margins. We see Jesus preaching servant leadership. At one point, his disciples are arguing about who's the greatest. And he tells them, don't seek that kind of greatness. Like the leaders of the Gentiles who, quote, lord it over them. Wonder who he's referring to again here, right? Jesus, there's a huge emphasis on how Jesus suffers to save others, and how Jesus says of himself that he came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Man, I love Mark. So rich. There's so much going on there. And one could wonder, we've got this one gospel Mark now in the mid-60s. Why would we need another gospel? But there's different needs in different situations, and there's more about Jesus to share. And so we get the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, both of which were written after Mark. And here's the thing about Matthew and Luke. Each of them uses Mark as a source material for their Gospels. Both of them, Matthew and Luke, quote Mark quite extensively. They keep the same scenes. They keep those scenes in the same order. They keep much of the same language. There's chunks of the text where it's word for word exactly the same, not just quotes from Jesus, but narrative descriptions and even parenthetical statements that the narrator is slipping in on the side all come through. At the same time as they're bringing these scenes in from Mark, they're editing them. Mark's Greek is actually not that great. It's pretty basic. Both Matthew and especially Luke have better Greek than Mark does. And so as they're copying Mark, they're updating his Greek. They're trying to emphasize different theological points. Sometimes they even correct Mark's data. I'll mention that in a bit. Matthew contains 97% approximately of the Gospel of Mark intact within the Gospel of Matthew, and Luke contains about 88%. And because of this tight relationship between the three Gospels, they're often called the Synoptic Gospels, which means it comes from the Greek synopsis, which means seeing together, seeing all together. So they see things similarly. But there's a puzzle with the Synoptic Gospels. We know that Matthew takes material from Mark. We know that Luke takes material from Mark. But there's also material that Matthew and Luke share that does not appear in the Gospel of Mark. And the question for a long time has been in scholarship, where is that same material coming from? Is Matthew taking it from Luke? Is Luke taking it from Matthew? Did one of them read the other gospel and write something else? And over time, what has been settled on by most scholars is what's called the two-source hypothesis. I know I'm being very technical here, but this is going to make sense. The idea of this is that both Matthew and Luke had another source in addition to Mark, which they were drawing from. This source has been, this hypothetical document, because we've never found it, is referred to as Q, which is short for quell, meaning source. And all of the Q quotes, the same quotes that appear in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark, seem to be sayings of Jesus. There's no narrative material. So the assumption is that this Q source was a collection of Jesus' sayings that was floating around at the time the Gospels were being written. Why does this matter? Because it helps us see how each Gospel is a work of craftsmanship, with the writer borrowing material from available sources and arranging it in different ways to tell the story they want to tell about Jesus and the truths they want to show about who Jesus is. So let's look at how Matthew does this. Matthew's community was very different from Mark's. While Mark's community most likely lived in Rome, Matthew's community was in Palestine. And because of this, we see some differences. So Mark has to explain local customs for his Roman audience. So for example, in Mark 7, I won't read the whole thing, but the Pharisees are criticizing Jesus' followers because they observe that they eat without washing their hands first, which, ew, right? But that's not they're not concerned about germs. Their concern is that they have a whole tradition around how you are supposed to eat foods in order to be clean and not unclean in how you do it. And one of that things involves washing. And so Mark tells his audience, there's that bolded part in parentheses I put, where Mark says, "For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders." And so on. He describes other things that they do as well. Well, Matthew uses this same incident from Mark and copies it over, changing a few words here and there. But Matthew does not include any of that. Parenthesis, he just cuts it out because his audience doesn't need it. They know that. They live in that part of the world. It's a very Jewish audience. And so Matthew just cuts it out and jumps straight from the beginning to the end of that whole section. Matthew is more oriented to the concerns of a Jewish audience because Matthew's community is a Jewish and Gentile community that is living and following more of a Jewish Christian approach to the faith. In Matthew, Jesus doesn't change any Old Testament laws or undo them in any way. Jesus is seen as a fulfillment of the Jewish law. You may remember me saying a while back that there was a disagreement in the early church about whether Christians still needed to keep Old Testament food laws or they didn't have to anymore. And Paul was on the no side of that argument. Paul thought that no one needed to keep the law anymore. But Matthew's community appears to have been on the yes side. At least there's some hints about that in the text. We can see it right here in the hand washing story. So if we move on, Mark says about it, Jesus goes on to say, as the Pharisees have criticized his disciples for not washing hands, he goes on to say, "Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart but the stomach and goes out into the sewer?" And Mark adds this parenthetical note, "Thus he declared all foods clean." So the Old Testament says some foods are clean and some are not. But here Mark says, no, Jesus is saying all foods are clean. And then he goes on to say, Jesus goes on to say that it's what comes out of you that defiles you, all these other sins and theft and murder and things like that. Well, here's what Matthew does with this story. Matthew strips Mark's parenthetical comment out of the middle. he intentionally leaves it out. He still says the same things. What enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer, but then he does not say, thus declared all food cleans. And he goes on and describes the things that come out of a person that make them unclean. And then he ends with this note. These are what defile a person, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile. This is a thing that was not in Mark's original text. The lesson that Matthew wants the readers to take away from this is that not that Jesus has done away with the Old Testament food laws, but that Jesus has done away with the Pharisees' interpretation of them, the tradition of the elders. This hand washing stuff isn't in the Old Testament. That's something that they added on to the food laws. For Matthew, Jesus is reinterpreting how God's people should live out their faith. We see this show up in other places, like in the Sermon on the Mount, where he says things like, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also." So you see, it's sort of like, here's what you heard, here's where I want you to go with this. And it's not an erasure of the Old Testament. It's sort of a new way of approaching it. Or sometimes it does feel a little bit like contradictory. I'm not sure how he does that, but a lot of times it's essentially a reinterpreting of the text. Now, Matthew organizes his entire gospel around 5 big blocks of teaching, with the Sermon on the Mount being one of them. Whereas Mark focused mostly on things Jesus did that showed who Jesus was, Matthew is focused on what Jesus wants to teach us about how to live as God's people. Pretty different gospel. Matthew also makes some very peculiar changes. I'm just going to throw them in here because I find them entertaining. For some reason, Matthew really likes pairs a lot, like twos, things in twos. And there's just tons of twos. People make a list on the internet about all the twos in Matthew. But sometimes he changes things from Mark that in a strange way to make them two. So Mark has one blind man who cries out to Jesus, "Son of David, have mercy on me," and Jesus heals him. But in Matthew, it's 2 blind men who cry out to Jesus saying, "Son of David, have mercy on me." In the same way, Matthew takes that same story that Mark had told about Jesus and the demon-possessed man named Legion and all the pigs and all of that running down the hill into the lake. And Matthew makes it about 2 demon-possessed men, not 1. And he removes the name Legion from the story. I don't know if he thought that was irrelevant, or he just wasn't going for the imperial theme that Mark was going for. So he edits that part out. And then he also corrects Mark's geography in the story, changing the location where it happens from Gerasa, which Mark has, but isn't even by a lake, to Gadara, which is right by the Lake of Galilee. One particular thing about Matthew that's pretty unique to Matthew, that is troubling, is this. So the Gospel of Matthew was written about 15 or 20 years after Mark, in the mid-80s, probably. And Matthew's community is facing really different challenges, both because of their location and this later point in time. After the Romans destroyed the temple in 70, the center of Jewish worship was gone. And so it moved out into the synagogues. They became the primary places of Jewish worship. And it was the Pharisees who held authority in these local synagogues primarily. Also, during this time, the synagogues became much less tolerant of religious diversity and began to actively expel the Jews who believed in Jesus from the synagogues. So in many parts of these things, there were some Christians who were still very much saw themselves as Jews and living out their Jewish faith and participating in the synagogues. And up to this point, they had been, and suddenly they get ejected from the synagogues. And presumably there's a lot of debate and bad feelings and harshness around this time. And this might explain the harsh tone in Matthew toward the Pharisees. In all the Gospels, Jesus argues with the Pharisees, but in Matthew, it is particularly polemical and intense. He calls them blind fools, children of hell. He has whole litanies of things to say against them. The negative tone in Matthew gets to its most caustic when the crowd demands, near the end, when the crowd demands that the Roman governor Pilate crucify Jesus. So in all the Gospels, I think all the Gospels, Pontius Pilate is the governor who's overseeing it and the trial, and tries to release Jesus to the crowds. and the crowd say, no, we want this other guy released, crucify Jesus. But only in Matthew does Pilate go to the extreme length of literally taking out a basin and washing his hands in front of the crowd, saying, look, I'm innocent of this man's blood. And the crowd responds to him, his blood be on us and our children. Neither Luke nor Matthew and Mark contains this detail. His blood be on us and our children. It sounds a lot like this text holds all the Jews forever, not just the ones who were in Jerusalem, but all Jews forever responsible for Jesus' death. And for this reason, some people over the years have called Matthew an anti-Semitic text. It's been used that way too. Historically, there's tremendous anti-Semitism in the European church through the Middle Ages, and before that in antiquity around the Mediterranean. And this text was used to justify anti-Semitism and violence towards the Jews. Personally, I don't think anti-Semitic is the right word for what's happening here, if only because the author and the audience were probably Jews themselves and very passionate about their connection to their Jewish identity. It's more likely meant as an indictment of the synagogue leaders who were contending with Matthew's community at that time. So these people who are the descendants of they're being framed as the descendants of those who crucified Jesus, and now here they are persecuting the community of Christians. Even so, with that explanation, I find the tone of some of the passages in Matthew pretty difficult to take, to be perfectly honest. It's hard. It's a hard read for me. It doesn't mean I don't count it as scripture and I don't ignore it, but I don't love all of it. But then at the same time, there's this amazing stuff in there. The Sermon on the Mount, one of the most profound texts ever. Some of Jesus' most memorable parables are in Matthew. This repeated presentation of God's kingdom as an upside-down one from this world, a place where those who mourn rejoice and the meek inherit the earth, comes from Matthew. I think it says something about the power of these works that even the one that I perfectly have the hardest time with and still has so much profound, amazing stuff that challenges me and encourages me. Now, moving on, Luke was written about the same time as Matthew, maybe slightly after, maybe in the mid-late 80s instead of the early mid-80s. But Luke's community is quite a contrast from Matthew's. While Matthew's community is deeply situated in the Jewish context in Palestine, Luke has a very different audience. In fact, he starts his gospel this way. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. So we know a bit more about the intention and writing of Luke than the other Gospels. We still don't know exactly who wrote it. The author doesn't name themselves. But we know that it's addressed to this person, Theophilus, who most likely was a wealthy Greek convert to Christianity, just judging by their name and the fact that this address is on the front of the gospel, and that this person has probably funded Luke's research and writing of the gospel and maybe about to fund its distribution as a work. And so Luke addresses the gospel to this person and writes for an educated Greco-Roman audience, using excellent Greek and an ancient historian's attention to detail. As a better Greek writer than Mark, he definitely improves Mark's style as he goes and copies the text. He makes lots of edits and changes. He's that person. He's that grammar nerd. He also acknowledges up front, as we just read, that he relies on multiple sources, and that he's even attempting to produce something that he feels wasn't there before, maybe an accurate enough or complete enough record of the life of Jesus. He uses the same sources as Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, the Q document, but he organizes them completely differently from how Matthew does. That they appear in different places, the events and the teachings. Instead of centering on 5 blocks of teaching, Luke orients around a long travel narrative where in the middle of the gospel, where it keeps talking about Jesus being on his way towards Jerusalem, which gives it a sense of forward motion and the feeling that Jerusalem and the crucifixion is always on the horizon. In Luke's gospel accounts, there's little differences too. Like in the beginning, I mentioned the different birth narratives. In Luke, it's Mary who receives the news that she will give birth to Jesus, not her husband Joseph, as in Matthew. And that brings up my favorite aspect of Juice, which is his orientation of Luke. My words are getting all tangled. It's his orientation towards inclusion and justice. I think I was trying to say the word justice. All of the Gospels include this thing of Jesus including others and this emphasis on justice, but Luke really leans into it. For example, both Matthew and Mark include a story, and it's the same story in both of them pretty much, where sometime in the middle of Jesus' ministry or later on, he returns to his hometown, and the people there reject him. And they reject him because they just can't accept him as someone special, having known him growing up and knowing his family personally. But Luke moves that story of Jesus' rejection at his hometown to the front of his gospel. And he brings in other material, presumably from another tradition, to include there. And so Jesus in his hometown in Luke, it's the first thing that happens in Jesus' ministry. Jesus gets up in a synagogue in his hometown and reads this text from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. By putting this at the beginning, it sets up Jesus' ministry as an act of liberation for the oppressed and inclusion for the outsider. And we see that throughout the gospel as Jesus includes women and tax collectors, and almost every other interaction Jesus has actually in the Gospel of Luke is with a woman. Along the way, there's such a heavy emphasis on inclusion. Samaritans are included, lepers are included. And Luke also gives us these beautiful stories, like the story of the prodigal son, about how someone can completely destroy their life and still be accepted and received by God. If Mark's emphasis is on God's kingdom as revealed in Jesus, and Matthew's emphasis is on Jesus as the new interpreter of what it means to be faithful to God as God's people, then Luke really highlights the God who loves the broken and the oppressed. And finally, we come to John. John was the last gospel written, possibly in the 90s. And Christians since the 2nd century have observed how very different John's gospel feels from the other. Here's just a few of the differences. Apart from the basic facts about Jesus' life, like, including like that he had a ministry and disciples and who they were and his death and resurrection, almost all of the specific events and teachings in John are different from the other gospels. In fact, he's missing some of the biggest events, like Jesus getting baptized, his temptation in the wilderness, his transfiguration, even the Last Supper is missing. Or the institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper. In John, Jesus doesn't cast out any demons at all, even though he does it constantly in the other Gospels. And in Mark, it's a major theme revealing Jesus' divine power. Nor does he tell any parables in the Gospel of John, even though Jesus speaks the most out of any of the Gospels in John, but he doesn't tell a single parable. He also barely talks about the kingdom of God. One little thing that always stands out to me in John is the other Gospels, Jesus is always trying to keep his identity on the down low, especially in the Gospel of Mark. He's so secretive that he even tells the demons he's casting out not to identify him. But in John, Jesus tells everyone. He's constantly talking about it openly. He tells the disciples, he tells the crowds, the Pharisees, everyone that he's God's son. One final thing to point out is that the time frame in John is different. The other Gospels could have taken place in just a few weeks, and Jesus only ends up in Jerusalem at the end. But in John, Jesus' ministry lasts clearly for 3 years, and he takes multiple trips to Jerusalem. Even the dating of the Last Supper, or like his meal with his disciples, and the dating of the crucifixion is different in John from the other Gospels. It happens on a different day in relationship to Passover. So if you date if you date Jesus' crucifixion according to John's Gospel, you get a date that he died in either 30 or 33. But if you date it by the Synoptics, he would have had to have died in 27 or 34. What do we do with this unique presentation of Jesus in the Gospel of John? Well, if you're like me as a sophomore discovering this for the first time, when I was in college, you sink into a depression of doubt wondering if you can ever believe the Bible, and avoiding reading John anymore because it's too distressing. It took me about almost a year to get over that. I'm not bothered by John anymore. I accept that John is probably drawing from a different set of traditions from the other Gospels, and I'm grateful that we have those traditions as well as the ones we see in the Synoptics. I also agree with the theologians of the early church who saw in John a more sophisticated reflection on the meaning of Jesus. John asks the big questions. Who is Jesus? What is his relation to God? And what does that mean for us? It's only John that includes these amazing I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd, the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. John is a philosophical feast that just makes us chew on the big ideas of God. And it's in John that Jesus invites us to be with him in the way he is with God. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. Sometimes people get turned on by John's more mystical approach to Jesus. But I think we moderns could use a lot more mysticism in our overly rationalistic, results-oriented faith. I hope this has been helpful for you. Obviously, I was trying to cram just a lot of stuff into this talk, and there's just too much stuff that I had to leave out even. But I want to end by coming back to this question. Is it okay that the Gospels are different? And I hope I've made clear my answer that yes, it's more than okay. It's very good. It's a reminder to us that no one perspective is going to capture all of who God is. We need the good news to meet us in many ways through the many things we're going through, from the many perspectives and experiences we bring. So let me ask you, how do you need to know Jesus today? As the anti-imperial Jesus, showing you who holds the real authority in this world of power and abuse? Is it as the Jesus who shows you how to live a radically different life of following God? The liberating Jesus who stands alongside the marginalized and oppressed? The mystical Jesus who draws you into intimacy with a God that we can barely get our mind around, but who is close to us anyway? We only have one saving God, as revealed to us through Jesus, but we can embrace different things about God every day and never run out of things to say about God. Thank you all for listening. I want to invite you to take those thoughts with you into a song of response now provided for us by a friend of CCF, Eric Lige.
The greatness of your majesty, you reign throughout eternity. You are awesome God.
In the glory of your mystery, you reach inside the heart of me. You are awesome God.
You are glorious. You are marvelous. You are awesome in power, mighty deliverer, victorious, more than enough for me. You are awesome God, awesome God. Sing it, Julia.
From the grandeur of the galaxies, you raise your voice to calm the seas. You are awesome God. And through the course of our humanity, you've shown your power for all to see. You are awesome God.
Hello, everyone. I am back. Special thank you to Chris for tonight's message. And as you've all been waiting for, my fifth and final favorite thing about CCF is the way that my spirit is always uplifted in the way that I feel empowered. Even though, it is virtual, I'm not seeing you all face to face until Zoom Hangout. I do feel very warm and happy that I was able to share this evening with you all. So thank you all for tuning in, and don't forget to join us for Post Friday Fellowship. Bye-bye.